Canadian, Australian, Brazilian, and Chilean Oberon class SSK, the Super O boats. So the Oberon classes that were built in the Royal Navy shipyards, which was all of them, were built really in two phases that fluidly blended together. In the early phase, where all the Royal Navy boats for the first half were the original Oberon design. But sometime in the early 60s, they began to modify the Oberon a little bit into what became known as the Super O boats. And they were just slightly different. They were the exact size and shape and displacement, but they had improved some of the systems. And we will talk about some of those systems today. So the Oberon class SSK Super O boats. Let's go. All right, so the Oberon, by the numbers, is exactly the same as the Royal Navy boats. The length is 90 meters with a beam of 8 meters. It's drafting 4.5 meters, so it has a lot of freeboard. Freeboard is the distance between the waterline and the deck where people are standing. That right there is pretty high off the water for a submarine, which is good. The fast attack that I was on, the rear quarter, about 20 to 25% of the aft half, just went right down into the water. Like you could literally walk into the ocean off the back of a 688. You wouldn't want to do that because there's a screw back there to chop you up if it was turning, but you could literally walk off a submarine and not even have to jump. But these submarines have lots of freeboard, a couple meters of it. Anyway, test depth is 200 meters, which is really shallow. This surprised me whenever I was doing the research about the submarine. This is a modern Cold War submarine that can only go to 650 feet safely, routinely, without needing to be recertified and have some special tests under the hull. So I was really shocked at how shallow she is. And this really is what limits her tactical ability to be an attack submarine. Now, these SSKs are considered attack submarines. That's what the K stands for. And so they have an attack role. But if you ever took an Oberon into a one-on-one fight with a modern, nuclear Russian submarine, you're probably not going to survive the encounter because you just simply can't clear datum fast enough. That's the second thing. Her submerged speed of 17 knots, it can only be sustained for a short time. It's not like she can run for 12 hours at 17 knots without killing the battery. But you're not going to evade a torpedo in a window of 650 feet and 17 knots. That torpedo is going to suck you up. And later on, this Oberon would have a harpoon capability. Now, the harpoon is notorious for its smoke-generating rocket booster, which leaves a finger trail pointing right back to the water where it emerged from. So any surface or airborne unit out there can simply look out across the horizon and see a smoke trail that is, half a mile long that rainbow arcs down into the water at the exact location that the submarine is when it launched it. So, the combination of low evasion depth and slow speed really limits her attack role. But she makes up for it in silence. And so a lot of today we'll be talking about how they used these Oberon submarines for intelligence gathering. And what the Canadian and especially the Australian navies did was bold, daring, and I don't want to foreshadow anymore because it was amazing. But let's go back to the numbers. Her diesel engine range is about 10,000 nautical miles. Her crew is between 69 and 75 people. That really varies depending on how many number of people are on board. Any crew with any submarine, it may have a value. For instance, the 688, I think we were supposed to have 125 or 26 people on board, and sometimes we would have 115, sometimes we'd have 130. So all these numbers, take them with a grain of salt. They're always in motion and flex. But she has the same Admiralty standard range V16 diesel engines to begin with. Those will be upgraded. The two 1280 kilowatt generators with two electric motors turning the shafts at 3,000 horsepower. The propellers, she has two 3-bladed propellers, and that's another big thing. In order to get any speed at all, submerged or surface, but especially submerged, out of a 3-bladed propeller, you've got to turn that propeller a lot, even if it has a big bite, which I'm sure that it does, because it's pushing this thing through the water. It's going to make a lot of noise. Ideally, what you would rather have is a screw blade that has more blades, that has less bite, and requires less turns complete 360 revolutions to push a large amount of water through the blades. The only way, or the way that they chose to do it, let's put it that way, was to put 2 3-bladed propellers on these things, and those are easily detectable even at slow speeds because they have to, each blade, grab so much water, and that makes noise. Even as quiet as it is on the battery, the propellers are going to be her Achilles heel above, I don't know, 5 knots maybe? I'll give her 5 knots being silent, but after that, you're going to see it. And the trick is, whenever that blade, here's something for you. This is kind of a sonar perspective here. No matter what the submarine or ship is, once that screw blade, the whole thing, does more than 360 degrees rotation in 1 second, it makes a harmonic on a sonar display. It's something about physics and natural law. It's not anything about sound silencing. It's whenever you do more than 1 complete revolution of any mechanical item in any medium, but we're talking about water here, it makes a reinforcement of that frequency, whatever it is. It could be 12 hertz, it could be 300 hertz, whatever the frequency is, doesn't matter. That frequency gets reinforced, and it means it has more energy, and it will show up more on your sonar system. So anytime they did any speed that required the screw to turn more than 360 degrees in 1 second, you could see them for sure, no doubt about it. So they just stayed below that. That's why they were really good at intelligence gathering. Anyway, I digress. Back to the torpedo tubes. They're 6'4", they're 53 centimeter. They can carry 20 torpedoes or 50 mines. 50 mines is a lot, quite a few mines for especially a diesel boat. And then back aft, they had 2 tubes that they didn't, honestly, I don't think they've ever shot. Maybe they shot them for testing, and that was about it. And they had the special short S-20 torpedoes back there. It was actually the M20S. That's the name of the torpedo. It's a special short electric torpedo that they simply hit a button and it swam out, and it was self-guiding, self-homing, not wire-guided by anything. It was almost a defensive countermeasure for someone behind you to allow you to maybe escape. You know, someone was coming up behind you. They were not reliable, and they did not have an indication that the tube was empty after they launched it. So they had to launch it, listen, see if they heard it leave, and if they did, shut the outer door, drain the tube, and hopefully the torpedo's still not sitting there. So the M20S was not that reliable. But that's a couple funny stories I ran across doing this. All right, so the Canadian Oberon SSK acquisition, they're all based out of Halifax, Nova Scotia. That's the 6th Fleet. In 1960, before they bought them, they had approached the Americans and said, hey, we're interested in the barbell subs, which were really expensive compared to the Oberons. So they ended up going with the Oberons in 1962. They signed an agreement. There was one already on the chalks that the Royal Navy was already considering going to the super O-boats, the newer equipment, but they had this Onyx on the chalks, and they were like, hey, we'll sell this one to Canada, but it's almost done, so it's not going to be a super O-boat. It's not going to meet your standards, but you can get it right away. And they, I'm sure they cut them a break and all that on the price, and Canada agreed to this. This is what also made the difference between buying an American barbell class and the Oberon was not just the price. They could get this first Oberon delivered right away. So it was modified as much as they could modify it at that time to increase the control room a little bit. They had a snorkel de-icer, a large air conditioner, and removed 3 crew bunks. So a submarine that already had few crew bunks had 3 less after this. But it was not a super O-boat yet. And then they renamed it. So the Onyx is renamed Ojibwa, and I'm going to murder these names, but I'm going to give them a shot. You got the Onondaga and the Okanagan were used for ASW training for the surface fleet. Now, they were used for more than training, but they were thought of as training boats mostly. They didn't deploy very far. They didn't do a lot of really cool things like the Australians are going to be doing, but they did deploy and they did go on mission. But they were mostly for saying, hey, we have a submarine fleet, we're training submarine sailors, and we are operational. That was about the extent of it, to be honest with you. And then we had, in 1975, we had SOUP, Submarine Operational Update Program, SOUP. They upgrade the Sperry passive sonar to a U.S. fire control system where they could fire the Mark 48 torpedo, which then they became very deadly submarines offensively because they went from that old Mark 37, they might have been able to shoot the Tigerfish too, but it doesn't matter at this point. They could shoot the Mark 48 now, as of 1985, and that was it was wire guided, thermal powered, and had great range, over the horizon targeting. And the Mark 48 torpedo did something no other torpedo had done up to this point for the Canadian Navy, and that was give telemetry back to the fire control system for what the torpedo saw. Okay, in 1989, the Olympus was purchased as a stationary training vehicle that was used there in Halifax. And in 1990, the Osiris was acquired for parts scavenging. And the Osiris was over in England, and they just scavenged the parts out of it and sent it over across the Atlantic for supply over in Canada. All right, so let's talk about S-72. She was built in Chatham Dockyard in 1962, launched in 64, commissioned the very next year. She was laid down as HMS Onyx, and this is not to be confused with the HMS Onyx that came later on. This is a little confusing that they use the same name twice, because technically they never commissioned HMS Onyx the first time. Its name was changed and sent to Canada. So HMS Onyx is back on briefing number 1, but it's not this Onyx. This Onyx became Ojibwa. Britain planned on improving the Oberon submarines after this build, and that's why they had sold it to Canada without the upgrades. They did modify the control room, like I said, but this one did not get the upgrades, all of them, until later on. The boat was renamed, like I said, and sent to Halifax. And this was the last of the baseline Oberons. Every Oberon after this, whether it's Brazilian or Australian, is going to be a Super O boat. It's going to have some of the new equipment in it. And in 1994, she had a midlife refit again that replaced the diesel engines with rebuilt engines from the HMS Osiris. So even whenever she has her midlife upgrades and is supposed to get new equipment, she's getting hand-me-down used equipment from the Royal Navy. And that was always kind of a meme back in the 90s, how the Canadians are just always using the hand-me-downs, like the Marine Corps for the Americans are always getting what's left over from the Army and the other forces. But they were rebuilt engines. So they had that. They were like new, although they were not new. Same with the Australians. The Australians later on, we're going to get some hand-me-downs. All right, so the second boat is the Onondaga S-73. Built, same place, Chatham Dockyard, 64, 65, commissioned in 67. She is the first Super O boat with many changes on her interior. So she has all the interior upgrades, the new ventilation system that helps keep the battery hydrogen low during charging, the modified air conditioning, which the Canadians needed the air conditioning, the new de-icer on the snorkel mast. That's all there. She has an open control room, which pushes all the equipment to the outboards and leaves a lot more space in and around the periscopes. Because you have like 13 people in the control room whenever you're normally operating. That's a lot of people in that little space. If you ever get a chance to tour one of these, I highly recommend it. They're in museums in Canada and in Australia. So whichever side of the planet you're on, you're near one of those two. Like I said, she had the enhanced ventilation, air conditioning, and the Canadian communications equipment was installed in her radio room. So that's the second of the 3 Canadian Navy Oberons. All right, and the third is the Okanagan Super O boat, built Chatham Dockyard, laid down the same year, 64, but not finished until 68 when she was commissioned and sent over to England. And there you can see the upgraded fire control system on the left. That little crosshair is really cool. There's 2 crosshairs on that screen, but they're on top of each other, so it looks like one crosshair. But what would happen is the crosshair that stays on the center and doesn't move is the torpedo. The crosshair that moves around the screen is what the torpedo sees as a target. And if the torpedo doesn't keep those 2 crosshairs on top of each other, the operator can manually steer the crosshairs, which is turning the torpedo, to get onto the target manually. Normally it's taken care of automatically, but you can do it manually as well. Okay, underhull operations. So here is something that the Canadians did, all the services did, and they did it really well. I have to give it to them. I did this too, all the navies do it, but the Russians probably do this. But that's where you go beneath another ship or submarine and take photographs of it so that you can see what the satellite imagery cannot. What arrays do they have beneath the waterline? Sonar arrays or any other non-acoustic arrays? What kind of screw blade configuration do they have? What is the configuration of the stern planes and the rudder? Is it different below the waterline than it is above the waterline? Taking underwater photography via the periscope is a big part of submarine operations even today, and it's very dangerous. Very dangerous. Here's a picture of them doing it, taking a picture of those three-bladed screws, but through the periscope. All right, so the Royal Canadian Navy Okanagan does collide with RFA Grey Rover off the coast of Faslane at the end of a training workup. It's not really a war game. It's a workup for deployment. It's a week-long event, 5 days normally, with lots of drills and spills. On the submarine, it's testing the crew's endurance. And at the end of that, they have one more thing to do. And that is to work with a support ship that's out there just watching them. The support ship's not really part of the workup. It's just there in case they need assistance. And it's also where a lot of the evaluation team would be sent. And if their workup involves civilian contractors, the civilian contractors, unless they needed to be on the submarine, would be on the support vessel. Okay, so support vessel's there. The last thing that they got to do is do an underhull observation, just like they do with the submarines, of this surfaced ship. This is a little bit easier because, the surface ship, exactly what depth it's at. Its keel, it's how much it drafts below the waterline, you know what depth to come up to. So they come up to 6-8 feet and they raise the periscope and they see the wake and the rear end of the ship a little bit ahead of them. And they start driving towards the screw blade. Now, the idea is whenever you don't do it like the movies where you drive between the screw blades like they did in, down periscope or something like that. What you do is you drive up the port side, get in front of the ship, and then slow down as you get over onto the starboard side in front of it, like you're doing a pass, and then let the ship overtake you. So you go up one side and down the other, taking pictures and recordings of the entire thing as you go around it. And that's what they begin doing here, but they get a little bit too close to the screw. They can easily avoid the screw, but for one thing. The screw blade of this ship is moving a lot of water, and it begins to suck the relatively lightweight submarine up into the screw blade suddenly. It goes from a normal operation to disaster. The screw blade of this ship begins ripping into the top of the sail, destroying masts and antennas and just gouging it like a big buzzsaw. The captain immediately orders emergency deep down to 180 feet, which is a terrifying maneuver to do when you have high pressure air deafening you, because that's coming into the control room now, and seawater's flooding the submarine. You don't know if you're going to make it back up to the surface, but they had to get away from that screw blade so that they could then surface. They couldn't surface under the ship. Terrifying experience, does a ton of damage, traumatizes the sailors. The sailors of this that were on board when this happened still talk about this. So they get out from underneath the ship, emergency blow all main ballast tanks up to the surface, where the ship is now stopped. They're stopped. They immediately launch red flares. They're like, get away from the ship. We don't know if it's going to sink. Thankfully, it doesn't. All the damage is in the sail, and now that it's on the surface, all the damage is above the waterline. Therefore, there's no more flooding. So the ship that has a damaged screw now and the submarine that has a damaged sail both return to the Faslane because they're right outside the coast. They can see land from where they're at. That's how close they are. And they go in and they repair everything. It's a huge embarrassment. It takes what was a very successful sea workup for the crew and just completely destroys all the good work that they had done, because they had passed this workup with flying colors up to this point. And it was just, they got a little too close to the screw and things rapidly escalated out of control, causing millions of dollars in damage. All right, midlife upgrades. The TCCS-9 torpedo control calculating system is installed. We saw a picture of that. In 1973, they could shoot the Mark 37 torpedo, which is an American torpedo, Mod 2, that used auto fuel. This gave it 6 extra knots and out to 12 nautical mile range. And in 1988, they replaced the Mark 37 with the Mark 48. That was a little bit earlier for some vessels, but in and around about 1988 is whenever they got the Mark 48 install. And they also got the ability to shoot the Harpoon cruise missile, which again gave them great over-the-horizon attack capability, but it also left you very vulnerable if anybody saw the launch. All right, let's move down to Brazil real quick and the Chileans. There's zero operational history public on these submarines. So we're just going to acknowledge that Brazil bought 3 and operated them locally in her waters. This was during the Cold War, but she was not a major participant in the Cold War. However, she did have lots of regional conflicts and tension with surrounding navies, namely Argentina for one. And so these submarines really played a role in the South American region. S-20 Humanita was built by Vickers Armstrong in the 70s, commissioned in 73, and she is now decommissioned in 1996. All of these, by the way, are decommissioned now. S-21 was the Tonelero. She was built in the Vickers Armstrong as well. 1971, commissioned in 77, and she is decommissioned now. And then finally, the Richelieu was built in 73, commissioned in 77, and is now a museum. She's part of the Naval Cultural Center in Rio de Janeiro. So if you find yourself on the South American continent, that is one opportunity for you to see them. I want to point out the sonar dome you see on the bow there. That sonar dome, if it doesn't encompass the entire bow, like you can see there's a little bit of the ship that comes out in front of it, that is the older British sonar system. Later Super O boats are going to have a larger dome, a new sonar system on the bow. All right, so let's talk about Pirate Rig real quick. I was fortunate enough to join the Navy when Pirate Rig was still a thing, but kind of going out of fashion, especially in the American Navy with the nuke boats. Pirate Rig was, once you were underway, you could dress in basically civilian clothes. Now, in the American Navy, you had to keep your poopy suit on, but beneath your poopy suit, you wore a t-shirt. Well, that t-shirt could be a Ron John t-shirt. It could be any t-shirt you want, no matter what color it was. It could have some funny slang saying on it that, you know, when we were in the chow line, we would unzip our poopy suit and show what our t-shirt said to each other. It was kind of a crew morale thing. Well, in the Oberon culture, they went full bore. They didn't even wear their poopy suits a lot of times underway. The officers generally did, but the enlisted crew, as you can see here, was in full up polo t-shirt, short wearing, sandal wearing around the boat. I love the mechanic with the headband on. That's freaking hilarious. And also, even though I don't see it in these pictures, in the American Navy in the beginning of my career, which was like late 80s or early 90s, we could wear ball caps, like your favorite football team, baseball team, whatever it was. Back in the 90s, there was a golf brand called Ping. I thought it would be funny to wear a Ping ball cap around because I was a sonar tech. Everyone thought I loved golf, but I never corrected them. I was like, yeah, I know what Ping stands for. This guy. So the Pirate Rig all went away in 1998, right about that time for the entire American Navy. They really cracked down on uniformity. So there was white t-shirts only, poopy suits fully zipped up. Everyone's the same. You don't have any decorative patches or anything. So for instance, after they cracked down on the pirate rigging, basically got it out of the American Navy, we had a torpedo man that had the same poopy suit as everybody else, but he had gone to the uniform shop, which is the legit place to buy uniform items, and bought a little American flag patch, little 3-inch by 2-inch American flag. And he had the uniform shop sew it on his uniform properly, like where it's supposed to go. But because nobody else, including the cob and the officers, had American flags on their poopy suits, that's the little jumpsuit they wear underway, they made him take it off. You couldn't even wear an American flag on an American uniform underway on an American warship, because that's how much they cracked down on pirate rig. There was no more pirate rig after 1998, 1999. That was over with. But it looks like the tradition continues in other navies, and it's great to see. Pirate rig. All right, let's talk about the Chilean boats. Again, not a lot of operational public history about these. Both of these are decommissioned now, but let's talk about where they were built. They were built, of course, in England in the Scott Lithgow shipyards, both for the Chileans were built in that shipyard. 1971, they were commissioned in 76, taken down. They operated for many years. One is a museum now in Valdivia, Chile, and the other one was just scrapped. And again, they just did local operations. The Chileans, I saw Chilean sailors up in Groton, Connecticut a number of times during my career in like the food court of the Navy Exchange. And I was asking around. I didn't speak their language, so I didn't talk to them directly. But I was like, what's going on? And people were saying, hey, yeah, there's a Chilean boat at Pier 2 of the waterfront, and that's the crew. They're coming off the boat. They came all the way up to America through the Panama Canal from Chile and stayed a week and trained with us, off the coast of Connecticut. And this happened a number of times. Now, the boats that I saw were not Oberon. They were Type 209 German diesel boats that Chile had bought. So I never saw these crews. But to give you an idea, even though they operate in local waters like the Brazilians did on the other side of South America, they would come visit us. The Chilean Navy and the American Navy have surprisingly close ties. So that's something that not a lot of people know about. I didn't even know about it until I saw it myself in the food court of a Navy base. Steel Beach. Oh man, every sailor loves Steel Beach, from the captain down to the lowest guy. That's where you surface the submarine in the middle of wherever you're at, and you have a cookout if you can. You don't always have a cookout, but hey, if you have the grill and you have the meat, cook it out. A lot of the larger submarines with more crew members, you just couldn't cook enough food to feed everybody, so a lot of times the cookout didn't happen. But you normally got a chance to swim, which was nice. Like I said, on the 688, you could just walk right into the water if you wanted to. But you can also just jump off the side. Jumping off the side of a submarine, very dangerous, by the way. You got to make sure you clear that thing because the submarine is round. So as you jump off the top, you still have a good, 5 to 6 feet of submarine that you need to clear before you hit water. So, but yeah, swimming is a big thing. And then occasionally, we didn't do this often, we would get to shoot the weapons. We would have, live fire training. We would take a box if we had cardboard underway, which we didn't normally, but we would take a box and we would tape with like a duct tape we called EB green around it to make the box kind of watertight and keep the shape of a box. And we would call it Oscar. Sometimes we'd draw a little happy face on it. And we would chuck Oscar into the water and let it drift away in the current. And then we would just light it up with M16 fire. And then if we weren't having a good day with that, we'd break out the M203 grenade launcher and try to blast the box out of the ocean and then back into it. It was like skeet shooting. But yeah, we would do Steel Beach. Steel Beach was fun. I only did Steel Beach, honestly, maybe 3 or 4 times in my whole career. So it's not very often, but when you do get it, it's a great time. And it's also a good morale boost. No matter how tired you are, I'm sure all the sailors in these pictures are exhausted because being underway on a submarine after a few days is just, it wears you down. But this is a good way to rejuvenate your energy, even if you're not sleeping. Steel Beach. Okay, so the 6 Royal Australian Navy Oberons, we're going to talk a lot about these, are the Super O boats. You can tell that by looking at where the sonar dome is, all the way forward up there. They've got the new sonar upgrade. Now, a lot of the Super O boats didn't have the new sonar dome in the very beginning. A lot of times that was a midlife refit, and I believe that is the case here with the Australians. So let's start with S-57 Oxley. Laid down in 64. All these are built in Scott's shipyard up there in England. Commissioned in 67. S-59 Otway was commissioned in 68. And she is a maritime museum now. And S-70 Ovens is a Western Australian museum, and she was commissioned in 1969. So all these were decommissioned in the early 90s. They're all gone now, but they have a great history, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. The other 3 were S-60 Onslow, commissioned in 69, became a museum in 99, and then the 2 mystery boats. These were the boats that the Australian sailors wanted to be on if they had a chance to. S-61 Orion, commissioned in 77, and S-62 Otama, commissioned in 1975, had special equipment installed, including radio gear, where they could go on special missions and collect intelligence for Australia and her allies. These two boats, especially, but they all gave us intelligence, but these two boats were primarily the intelligence collecting boats for the Royal Australian Navy. And they would share their information with us, which was really nice. So there was a big cooperation between Canada, the Royal Navy, the Australian Navy, and the American Navy, all sharing intelligence with each other. And between the four of us, we had a lot of the globe covered. It was great. And these guys were key for covering that South China Sea, Indian Ocean, South Pacific area. That's a lot of ocean for just 6 boats to be in. Anyway, so 61 and 62, these are the 2 mystery boats. Okay, Cold War operations, all the boats, all 6 of them, would stay out to sea for up to 50 days. They could even stay longer than 50, but a typical underway was 40 to 50 days. That was broken up usually into a transit. They have to get to wherever they're going. They would spend about 3 weeks on station, supporting whatever operation that they were a part of, collecting intelligence, and then they would transit back. And by the time they did all that transit time with the operational time, it was pretty close to 50 days. They would stay submerged for a surprising part of that. Of course, they would be submerged for the entire operational part, but even on the transit part, they would stay submerged because they had to get to waters that would not give away their operation if they surfaced near it. In other words, as soon as you want to transit home, of course, it's a little bit faster to transit and recharge your batteries on the surface than it is submerged, but you don't want to do that right off the coast of, say, Vietnam or especially China, because then they're going to notice. They're going to be like, what have you been doing for 2 weeks? So they would have to transit away from the country out to deep blue water and then, start transiting home submerged and then surface, snorkel, charge the batteries, and keep going. They generally only surfaced to enter and exit port, and they worked a lot with special forces. These are the guys that would go ashore, break things, and come back with less ammo than they left with. Midlife upgrades for the Royal Australian Navy. So they replaced the sonar with CSU-31 attack sonar, and whenever they get that's the big bulb that goes all the way out around the bow. A little bit larger sonar array, placed a little bit farther forward. The BRA-34, which is a great American radio antenna. I was surprised we sold it to the Australians. They used it too. The nice thing about the BRA-34 is that it's a multi-function mast. It can do all sorts of radio things, all in one package. So we sold that to them. And we, of course, gave them the Nestor crypto UHF satellite comms. Nestor used to be a classified term, but it's been unclassified apparently because it's all over the internet now, or someone just leaked it and I'm making it worse. But yeah, Nestor was the name of the crypto gear they used to communicate with us and everybody else. All right, August 1980 Indian Ocean exercise with Sand Groper changed everything. Up to this point, with the exception of the 2 mystery boats, submarine operations out of Australia were pretty clockwork mice, which means they were routine. They're relatively small vessels that can do a high amount of damage. That's the clockwork mice term. But they were also kind of in their own zone, left alone, and not used to their full potential. That's what I'm getting at. Obviously, the 2 mystery boats were doing great things, but the other 4 were doing some intel work and just going to sea to stay proficient. Until August 1980. This all changes during the Cold War. Sand Groper is the largest Australian operation since World War II. It's a war game. Exercise Sand Groper. It includes Australia's only aircraft carrier, which they had at the time. They don't have this aircraft carrier anymore. They decommissioned it. But back then they had one aircraft carrier. We would call it an LHD in America. But they had one. They had several destroyers, and they had the Ottawa submarine was with them. And during this operation, they're being watched very closely and sometimes interfered with by the warship you see here, the Stroroziov. It's a Russian destroyer. Might be a cruiser. We'll call it a destroyer. And the Ivan Rogov, which is an amphibious support ship that's with this Russian ship. And they're shadowing the war group, exercise during the entire exercise, which is like a week long. And then they occasionally run it in and get in the way of them doing their war games, causing trouble. It's what the Russians were doing during the Cold War. So, of course, they get a radio report out to the Admiralty back in Australia, and they're like, hey, the Russians are here. They're screwing with our war game, just letting you know. And they were not believed. I don't know what's going on over in Australia with the leadership over there, but they were not believed. They didn't believe their own Navy seeing Russian warships. And the thinking was, well, they had never done this before. What the hell does Russia want with us, with the Australian Navy? Well, what Russia was doing was the Americans in the 70s had begun deploying their carriers to the Persian Gulf. Persian Gulf was becoming a proxy war of the Cold War. It had been, actually, for a while. And so in order to practice or see what NATO tactics were, they would go down and watch the Australians do this war game to get an idea of the capabilities of their Western counterparts. And so it was more of an intelligence collection thing than anything else, and some harassment, because the Russians tend to get off on that. But they were trying to collect Western tactical information. And what they did was they had the Ottawa go in and do an underhaul and take pictures and make audio recordings. And she did that outstandingly. So whenever the war game was over, they marched their happy ass right up to Navy headquarters, slapped the tapes in the tape player and played it for the Naval Admiralty and said, see, we got big problems. The Russians have noticed us. And now they need to start preparing themselves for this to happen again in the future. And it changes naval operations forever, especially for the submarine force in the Royal Australian Navy. All began with Exercise Sandgroper. All right, so my final thoughts on the Oberons is, wow, I'm really impressed with the amount of work, intelligence-wise, that they did. The cool thing about the Oberon design is that it's relatively light and small to the American nuke boats. This gives it a huge advantage in that it's very quiet and it can get very close to the shorelines. I mean, it can get right up to a harbor, take pictures, and get out with nobody knowing it was ever there. You could do that in a nuke boat, but it's much more difficult. These guys were able to get closer than the American nuke boats were able to get reliably and safely without causing a international incident. We collected a ton of intelligence from them, from Vietnam, the Philippines, even though these were kind of allies, and especially China. Yeah, they were all up in there. North Korea, oh man. There was a story about the Oberon who was hanging out off the coast of Cam Ranh Bay, which is in Vietnam, and just sitting there when they hear a Soviet destroyer coming into port. And they take that opportunity because the Soviet destroyer, for some reason, is doing like 5 knots, which is, he's not in a hurry to get anywhere. They were able to get up behind him and do a complete underhaul and take photographs of him without being detected. So great ship operated by great crews around the world, whether it's Brazil, Canada, the Royal Navy, or the Australian Navy, collecting intelligence from these boats. These were intel-grabbing boats that also, after midlife upgrades, had some pretty good offensive capability with that Mark 48 torpedo. The Harpoon, if you had a target that was over the horizon, you might be safe to shoot the Harpoon. You just don't want him to see that smoke trail pointing to your location, because he's going to get the bearing whenever he sees the missile coming in at him. Anyway, so Special Forces support, they did a lot of that. Now, they were really limited in the Special Forces support by the size of their submarine. It's already a pretty small submarine that's chock full of sailors. You know, they can make room if they need to for special operations and their equipment, but there's not a lot of room left. What they would do to make room for the special operations people is not load as many torpedoes in the torpedo room. They would have a half load out, or maybe just have torpedoes in the torpedo tubes, because they had 6 forward tubes, and have a completely empty torpedo room where Special Forces could have bunks, keep their ammo and guns and equipment, and they could do their planning meetings away from the crew because they would have their own space in the torpedo room. So that's how they would support Special Forces doing that. Oberon submarines undertook the most hazardous tasks of their navies. That's true, especially in the Australian Navy. They were collecting intelligence and supporting Special Forces unlike any other naval unit could do, because they could do it clandestinely. You can't park a destroyer off the coast of Cam Ranh Bay and not get asked questions, you know, but you can do that if you're in a submarine, especially if that submarine's an Oberon. So the Oberon operations required courage and daring from the crews. The crews were well trained. The ships were surprisingly well maintained. The rumors that they could only operate 5 out of the 6 submarines in Australia are just that. They're not true. They operated 6 for the full time. They were able to get parts from England. Now, at the end of the life of the submarine, those parts did begin to dry up. That's true. But they managed to maintain 6 operational boats until decommissioning. So hats off to the people that were able to keep these boats going for as long as they did. Really impressed with the operational capability of these sailors.